Wow, that's a nice introduction. That's an impressive performance. Did you like that? Yeah. So, many thanks for the invitation to speak here. It's an absolute pleasure to be in New Zealand and to enjoy your hospitality. I have a lot to tell you today. The first of which is that I am the unofficial carrier of a mutation in the gene for optimism. And so everything you hear has to be seen in that perspective. I think you all deserve a better future, and I think it is on the horizon. We all need to work hard together, but I'm an optimist, and I think it's within reach. I also wanted to thank everybody here in this country for amazing hospitality. You have really given that word a new dimension. It's written in capital letters here. Right from day one, I'm here with my youngest son, and we've been traveling this country, and it's been outstanding. The people, the culture, your natural beauties, just incredible. Within an hour after our arrival, we had our first Fergburger. We played golf. We watched the All Blacks play in a pub, and funnily enough, we dressed up for the occasion, only to find ourselves being the only ones dressed up for the occasion. So they looked at us as real New Zealanders, I suppose. Went skiing twice. I mean, just incredible. So my question to you is: do you have a job for me out here? Can I stay? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I can basically, I can do Parkinson's, I could do epilepsy, or anything else you like. My son actually found this in Queenstown. Queenstown was the first city we visited, and we found this sign, and it literally said, "This is such a healthy place," I suppose it's true for the rest of New Zealand, "that no medical man has yet been able to establish himself here." Well, you found him. I will show it can be done. And I also wanted to congratulate Parkinson's New Zealand on your 40th anniversary. I sincerely hope, I think the 50th will still be realistic. I hope that you will never celebrate your 80th anniversary. It means Parkinson's is gone by that time. I'm not sure if that's the case, but it would be wonderful if... I always say, people ask me, what is your ambition? And my ambition is to make myself unemployed, to make me lose my job, because it means Parkinson's is gone. And I always really enjoy speaking to a crowd of people with Parkinson's and their family, because you're hungry, like birds angry to be fed with information. So nothing is more gratifying but to speak to an audience such as yourselves. So it's an honor and a privilege to be here. I realize that this particular talk can be a bit worrisome, because I'll be talking about the growth of Parkinson's, which is literally exploding, and I will tell you why this is happening and why we need to take action. So that is a bit of a worrisome part of my talk, but I told you I have this mutation in the gene for optimism, and I wanted to share the words of the late and great Tom Isaacs. He passed away not because of Parkinson's, but he had an unfortunate other medical condition. But he used to say, "I want to be the first person in the world who can say, I used to have Parkinson's disease." How about that for optimism? And this is truly a time of hope and optimism. So this talk is mainly about the growth of Parkinson's and what we need to do about it as a society and why we should all become activists. But I was not going to do this presentation without letting you know that I honestly feel that having Parkinson's today is different from 10 years ago, let alone 20, 30 years ago. There are better treatments. There's hope on the horizon that we can maybe slow down Parkinson's disease, whether this be with drugs or maybe lifestyle interventions. The awareness that Parkinson's is here and that it is such an impactful disease is better established now among governments and other influential bodies. So I think there is genuine hope for a better future within reach. But again, I'll be talking about some worrisome developments, but keep that in mind that I am an optimist and that it is really a time of hope. So I am an activist in the true sense of the word. And if you were wondering if I'm in the audience, I'm actually there. trying to fight what we have now called the Parkinson pandemic. If you're interested, we published a book, you see it on the left, it's called Ending Parkinson's Disease. Again, how about that for hope and optimism? It's been translated now into Chinese, into Dutch, and German, and it describes essentially what I'm talking about today, and we called it a Parkinson pandemic. And you know, a pandemic is a disease that is occurring worldwide. It's affecting men and women. It's a debilitating disease. It's an impactful disease. And it's growing fast. And Parkinson's ticks all those boxes, except for an infectious etiology. But otherwise, Parkinson's is really like a pandemic. And these are the data that are so disconcerting. This is the worldwide growth of Parkinson's. The disease has doubled in the last 20 years, and the disease is expected to double again in the next 20 years. Having said that, the reality is unfortunately even worse. The latest data just came out in The Lancet, a survey called the Global Survey of Diseases, where they are monitoring the growth of all sorts of neurological conditions. And the truth is, the latest data is this. So the growth is exceeding our worst expectations. We've already reached the numbers we expected to reach by the year 2035. And this makes Parkinson's the world's fastest growing neurological condition. And that's something to be concerned about. It's a disease that literally spares no one. These are all well-known singers who developed Parkinson's. These are athletes. Exercise reduces the risk of Parkinson's, but it doesn't give you full protection. These are all athletes that developed the disease. These are actors. You'll recognize Michael J. Fox, Robin Williams, for example. I actually visited the Hobbiton thing here, and Ian Holm, I didn't realize, actually had Parkinson's. And these are politicians. And you may see something peculiar about all these people that I showed. And this was the Pope, of course. And what is peculiar, these are all men. And yes, Parkinson's affects men more often than it affects women. And that will become relevant later in my presentation. But Parkinson's certainly does affect women, as many of you in the audience will know. This is one of the oldest images of Parkinson's. Can you hit on play on the video? I think it's not running automatically here. So let's see if it will run. These are very old images going back to the early 20th century. It's not, can you click on it? Otherwise it's okay, don't worry about it. This is an example of Linda Ronstadt. This is a woman with Parkinson's. So yes, men are affected more often than women. And again, it'll become relevant later on in my talk. And then the latest numbers suggest worldwide it's 11.8 million people with Parkinson's. But in effect, we think the numbers are even larger because we know that Parkinson's may go undetected for a long time, particularly in countries with a less well-equipped healthcare system. In Africa, we know that in Brazil, for example, in India, many people go about with Parkinson's undetected. And even in the Netherlands, when we surveyed nursing homes, we found a lot of people with Parkinson's that had never been diagnosed. So underreport is there. So the numbers in effect are even larger than what I showed to you. And in order to understand the growth, I will explain a little metaphor to you, and it's a bathtub. So the numbers I showed you is the water level in the bathtub, and that water level is rising fast. The question is whether the fountain is being opened more widely. That would be one reason why the water levels are rising. And from what we think is, and this is called the incidence in medical terms, we think that the incidence, the influx of new patients is more or less steady. That's not growing, at least not in Western societies. It is probably, or we think, growing in China, and I'll come to that later, but we think the incidence is stable. That's nothing to be happy about, because every new patient, I think, is largely driven by environmental causes. More about that later. The two reasons why the water is rising despite a steady influx is that we get older, but aging per se is not the cause of Parkinson's. I will explain that to you. And another good news is that people live longer these days with Parkinson's. So if the outflux of the bathtub is slowing down, it means the water levels are rising. Does that make sense? And the good news that in the Netherlands, where we have Parkinson Net, it's a nationwide network of well-trained, well-educated, skilled professionals who have received deep baseline training in Parkinson care, who collaborate as a team and who attract many, many patients in their practice. In the Netherlands leads to fewer hip fractures, fewer hospital admissions, and people live longer. So we have shown in the Netherlands that mortality, the risk of dying of Parkinson's or with Parkinson's, is going down, thanks to specialized physiotherapists, thanks to specialized occupational therapists. And if you live longer, the water in the bathtub will rise. I hope that makes sense. And this is the first positive message. And in better times in the United States, I'm not sure what you think of the whole election process. Barack Obama used to say, saving costs, saving lives. This was his mission for healthcare. And this is exactly what Parkinson Net is doing, because the better care in Holland also leads to millions and millions in cost savings. So people often say, well, you know, these are just old people and it's only aging. And that is not true. So yes, Parkinson's, the risk of Parkinson's is related to aging. So the older people get, the higher the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And you can see that the risk is higher for men than it is for women. The interesting thing is James Parkinson described the disease for the first time in 1817. And one fact that you may or may not know is that he described the disease partially based on people he saw walking on the streets. Because it's such a recognizable condition that he just described people walking on the streets. But what he described very clearly is that he found a new condition that had not been described before. The clinicians in the 15th, 16th, 17th century were astute clinicians, but there are no reliable descriptions of Parkinson's disease prior to 1817. And people say, oh, well, people would grow less old in those days, which is true, but if you survived childhood, people would become 50, 60, sometimes 70 years old. 1 in 3 patients is under the age of 65 at the time when the disease starts. And a decent proportion is like Michael J. Fox, who was 32 when he developed the disease. We have a program in my center for pregnant women with Parkinson's. And believe me, if those wonderful clinicians in the 16th century saw a Parkinson syndrome in a young pregnant woman, that should have caught people's eyes. And it's not there, it's not in textbooks, it's not being described. Interestingly, until mid-previous century, in fact until the 1970s, people still felt that Parkinson's was a very rare condition. So this is aging. And you see, we're becoming older, right? But when James Parkinson described the disease, the longevity effect had not kicked in. So it's not the fact that people were growing older at the time, it's the air pollution in London at the time. And at the same time, a famous neurologist, Bas Bloem, said in 1974, Parkinson's is a very rare disease. And at that time, the aging effect had already kicked in. In fact, Bas Bloem said, he was so certain, 1974, if you find a new Parkinson case, this is such a rare disease, I'll offer you a bottle of scotch. Well, the man would be bankrupt today, right? And if you then buy a bottle of scotch, I would recommend the Macallan 1967, which happens to be my date of birth, and it's a really good whiskey. It's before the Macallan company changed its wooden barrels for metal barrels, which they should never have done. But anyways, that's a... And so the latest data show that Parkinson's is now 11.8 million people in the world. And if you look at age-standardized rates, if you correct the growth of Parkinson's for the aging effect, Parkinson's is still growing by 60%. So Parkinson's is growing over and above the aging effect. That's another argument why it is not just aging. If you look at, for example, age-standardized rates for Alzheimer's disease Alzheimer's remains more or less stable. Can you see that? The growth is just 3%. In other words, the growth of Alzheimer's is explained by aging. Parkinson's grows much faster than Alzheimer's. And in fact, strokes are shrinking after correction for aging because we are now better at preventing strokes with better treatment. And literally the only neurological disease that was growing over and above the aging effect was Parkinson's disease. And this is a figure that we just published. You'll recognize this image, right? This is the risk of Parkinson's as a function of aging, higher risk in men compared to women. Now the next graph is the risk of lung cancer. And the graph is identical. Isn't it? It looks identical. Nobody in the world will tell you that aging is the cause of lung cancer. The cause of lung cancer is smoking. The aging effect for lung cancer means you've had enough time to smoke enough cigarettes to cause lung cancer. The aging effect in Parkinson's disease, to my mind, means you've had sufficient time to be exposed to toxins in our environment that are ultimately contributing to Parkinson's. So it is smoking that causes lung cancer and not aging. And I think it is environmental toxins that are causing Parkinson's, not aging. Other people claim, well, we've become better clinicians. And that might be the case, but this is not the reason why Parkinson's is growing. For multiple sclerosis, shown here in blue, the prevalence remains more or less stable, even though the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis has been revolutionized by the arrival of MRI and cerebral spinal fluid diagnosis. So if Parkinson's was a result of better diagnosis, better clinicians, MS should also have risen. But MS is not rising and Parkinson's is rising fast. So it's not better diagnostics. Then people say, well, is there a genetic component? And I think all of you know that there are certain genetic factors that can contribute to Parkinson's. And yes, this is definitely playing a role. Genetics contributes to Parkinson's. But there are two very interesting features to mention here. One is famous researchers in the world, Professor Carly Tanner was the first in California, have looked at identical twins. And the idea is that if a disease has a strong genetic component, then identical twins should have the same disease more often than dizygotic twins. Does that make sense? All right. People have looked at this, and I rearranged the graph. And for example, at the top is type 1 diabetes, which has a very, very strong genetic component. And you can see that Parkinson's is right at the bottom. So yes, there is a genetic component to Parkinson's, but it is small. And it is much, much smaller than for any other disease that has been tested. And then the other really interesting fact is that these genetic mutations, and I'm using one example here, it's the so-called GBA mutation. Some of you may have heard of this. GBA mutations are present in 15% of Dutch patients. I asked my geneticist, how old are these mutations? And people can calculate this. The metaphor is if you drop a stone in the water, you have these rings of water that gradually spread. A mutation arises somewhere, a stroke of bad luck. And then people find a spouse, have children, they move out and about, and gradually the mutation starts to spread across the planet. And the more the mutation has spread, the older the mutation. The GBA mutation is thousands of years old. So if GBA by itself was the cause of Parkinson's, we should have seen the disease prior to 1817, but we didn't. Same is true for many of the other mutations. So what we now feel is that the genes make you more susceptible to exposure to environmental chemicals, and we know that if you introduce these genetic mutations into a mouse or a rat, the rat becomes extra vulnerable to pesticides, for example. So the genes that had been around for centuries only became relevant after we started polluting our environment. On a brighter note, you see that lifestyle is here. And certain lifestyle factors are beneficial. It's exercise and healthy diet, in particular a Mediterranean diet, will help to reduce the risk of Parkinson's. So summed up, I am personally convinced that just like the pyramids in Egypt, Parkinson's is at least to an extent, if not to a large extent, a man-made disease. The positive note being that it makes it a preventable disease. I think we should take effort to prevent future generations from developing this disease. Now, a quick word on the protective factors. Whether or not an individual develops Parkinson's is complex, it's a weighing scale. It's the risk factors, including pesticides, including traumatic brain injury, for example, but also protective factors. For example, exercise or a few cups of coffee. Just a quick word on a few protective factors, because one question I get asked a lot in clinic is, what should I tell my children in order to prevent Parkinson's from happening, or other beloved ones? And exercise is associated with a lower risk of developing Parkinson's. So regardless of whether you have a genetic risk factor or not, I think everybody in the world should exercise on a regular basis in the hope of preventing Parkinson's. A few cups of coffee, interestingly enough, are associated with a lower risk of developing the disease. Whether coffee helps you if you already have Parkinson's, we don't know. It may help with your bowel movements. And lest I forget, optimizing your bowel movements is essential for every person with Parkinson's, because slow bowel movements will lead to changes in the gut microbiota, which will interfere with the efficacy of your medication. So make sure you have regular bowel movements, exercise, ample fluids, high fiber diet, laxatives if needed. But really make sure you have regular bowel movements. And a few cups of coffee might help. The Mediterranean diet has been associated with a lower risk of developing Parkinson's. And there are now 2 new studies to show that if you already have Parkinson's, and if you adhere faithfully to the Mediterranean diet, your disease may progress at a slower pace. So I had patients saying, oh, should I take souvlaki, like the meat? And no, it's the salmon, the fish, the veggies, the olive oil, and the nuts, not the meat that they're taking. And this was a quite provocative report, which suggested that part of the, this is classified information, it showed that because we smoke less, Parkinson's is also growing. For reasons we don't understand, people who have smoked have a lower risk of developing Parkinson's. Now, please, don't start smoking. Don't recommend anybody to go and smoke, because the risks of breast cancer, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease outweigh all the benefits, if any. But interestingly, and this is a topic for further research among scientists, the most consistently associated factor with Parkinson's is smoking, for reasons we don't fully understand. We can brainstorm afterwards, but we don't know. So I am particularly concerned about pesticides. But it's not just pesticides. James Parkinson described the disease in 1817, and I think this was not a coincidence, because this was when air pollution was taking grotesque forms in London, with the infamous smog. It's still taking place, for example, in China. This is a picture I took from the internet. This is everyday China, and in China, Parkinson's is exploding. It's really exploding in China, even faster than in any other part of the world. This is the United States, and you can see that Parkinson's is not evenly distributed across the country, but it's more prominent in areas with more air pollution. It's not a one-to-one correlation, and this is not necessarily showing causality, but there is all these hints that air pollution is one of the contributing factors to the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Repeat head trauma. This is from a cartoon from the Dutch version of the book Ending Parkinson's Disease. One of my patients is a wonderful artist, and this is Muhammad Ali punching his own brain. Isn't that a brilliant, genius idea? And we know that repeat head trauma is another risk factor for Parkinson's. So if you've had your occasional concussion, don't worry about it. And by the way, looking back and saying, why did I get Parkinson's and not somebody else? Looking back is a waste of energy. And that one concussion is not the cause of your Parkinson's. We're talking Muhammad Ali and repeat head trauma. It is something we should worry about in trying to ban headers in football, in elementary school and in high school. I think we should protect our children from repeat head trauma. A chemical you should worry about is trichloroethylene. Trichloroethylene is abundant. It was used to decrease metals. it was used in dry cleaners, it was used to decaffeinate coffee, to clean carpets, and TCE is a notorious cause of Parkinson's. The problem is, TCE was dumped by industry in the environment. It could travel for kilometers under the earth. It could evaporate into your house. You don't see it, you don't smell it, but it can cause your Parkinson's. So TCE is another great concern. It's been banned in the Netherlands. I'm not sure about how the situation is here, but it stays in the climate, in the environment for years and years. I know that the United States has so-called Superfund sites, heavily contaminated sites that contain lots and lots of TCE. One of those sites is Camp Lejeune, where the Americans are training their Marines. Camp Lejeune used to be the site of a dry cleaning factory, and it was dumping all the TCE. Then later the Marine base was built, and the Marines at Camp Lejeune disproportionately often developed Parkinson's, whereas exactly comparable alternative training camp elsewhere in the States, the Marines were not developing Parkinson's. So TCE is a factor, but I'm particularly concerned, and I will focus in particular now on pesticides. Again, this is a beautiful cartoon from my book. Isn't it lovely how Marina Noordegaaf is doing that? This is the use of pesticides worldwide. It has grown exponentially. There's a lot of pesticides in the world, in particular since World War II, when we needed to feed a fast-growing world population. The use of pesticides has gone up, and so has the prevalence of Parkinson's. This is an example, paraquat. Paraquat well, I think you can now say 30 studies. Multiple studies have consistently linked exposure to paraquat, a widely used pesticide, to a higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease. This is the latest study, just came out in a top-notch journal. Beautifully done work in California, where they have very meticulous registries of the historical use of pesticides, and they show clearly that farmers, but also people living in the vicinity of farmland, have a markedly increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. I think the evidence against paraquat is overwhelming and persuasive. And we just had an editorial accepted earlier this week. The problem is, there are 2 studies that suggest paraquat is safe. The authors of these 2 studies are employees of Syngenta, who manufactures paraquat. And the study was performed among, guess what, employees of Syngenta. What I find, and all the other evidence, so we say the burden of proof has definitively shifted. This final publication by Kimberly Paul has definitively shifted the burden, yet the EPA, which is called Environmental Protection Agency, is protecting industry and not you. The United States is on the brink of extending the license for paraquat, and Australia is still using it. The nickname for paraquat is 1 sip can kill you. It was used by farmers who considered suicide. It was a suicide compound. And I checked, and it's still being used here in New Zealand as well. So that's quite stunning. And I'm an activist. I think all of you should be an activist. I think Parkinson's New Zealand should be an activist. And we should do something about it. In particular, and I'll come to that in a minute, but in case I forget, you might think, oh well, I already have the disease. It's too late for me. No, because there are now 3 studies that show that if you are still exposed to pesticides after the diagnosis, your disease takes a more aggressive course. On a positive note, if you manage to steer away from pesticides, you will have a more benign disease course and a better prognosis, which makes perfect sense. If you have fewer healthy brain cells alive, you should do everything to protect them, including steering away from pesticides, TCE, and other chemicals. And this is a bit of a technical slide, but these are all the studies in the world that looked at pesticides and Parkinson's, and this is sort of the summary, and it showed a consistently increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So it's not just one study, it's not just one pesticide, it's multiple studies. And interestingly, I told you before, men have a higher risk, and we think this is because men are more often engaged in jobs which bring them into contact with, say, pesticides, because they're more often farmers, they're more often chemical workers, they are more often painters. And interestingly, there is one country in the world where Parkinson's is more common in women, and this is in Japan. So this is farming, but in Japan, women do the farming. And lo and behold, in Japan, Parkinson's is more common among women. Now, it doesn't prove everything, but it's all quite suggestive. So I came across this cartoon, which I thought was interesting. So farmers try to protect themselves. The problem is, and this was really top journalism work done by Le Monde. Le Monde is the famous French journal, is that the suits that the farmers are using is not protecting them well. The pesticides just go through the suits, through the gloves, through their masks, and still intoxicate these people. And if you live in the vicinity, if you're the neighbor of a farmer, you have no way of protecting yourself, right? So these are the three groups that are at risk. In the center, you see people working professionally with pesticides, and we know that farmers have a markedly increased risk of developing Parkinson's. We know that people living in the vicinity of farmland, their neighbors, have a consistently increased risk. The question is whether everyone in the population is at risk through the food chain. Certainly, we know that if you look at the population level, pesticides are found in 40% of people tested in the USA. And this is obviously not just farmers. It affects all of us. It was found in a lot of children who were tested for pesticides. And one major question that is unresolved is whether you can develop Parkinson's if you're exposed to pesticides via the food chain. The honest answer is I don't know. I don't know. There's one compelling example in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, the farmers asked for permission to use a particular pesticide, heptachlor, on the crops for pineapples. And they got permission. The remnants, of the plant were fed to cows. And the pesticides, the heptachlor, made it into cow milk and was subsequently found in the brains of people with Parkinson's. It was found in breast milk of young mothers who were feeding their children. Now, this is one example, and it's the only example that I know where pesticides made it into the food chain and via the food chain made it to the brains of people with Parkinson's. We know that red wines in France contain multiple pesticides. Red wines in Dutch supermarkets have been tested, contain 7 different pesticides, including Roundup. Whether this is the cause of Parkinson's, I don't know. Is it a reason for concern? I'm concerned. There's a lot of pesticides on fruit, for example, raisins, grapes, etc. A dramatic rise is in this article. And I took this picture when I was touring the United States. This is a supermarket in the US. Alongside with your bleach, you can buy your insecticides. So, these are consumer products. Now, is this all causal? The disappearance of the stork in the Netherlands was associated with a reduction in the birth rate. That doesn't prove that storks bring babies. So everything I told you so far are, in a technical term, associations. They do not necessarily prove causality. Yet I think the relationship is more than an association. I think it's causal because if you feed pesticides to a rodent, to a mouse, to a rat, to a monkey, it kills off exactly the substantia nigra, the part of the brain involved in Parkinson's, and it causes Parkinson's symptoms in an experimental animal. So that is suggestive that this is a causal relationship. And there was an experiment of nature that I will quickly draw your attention to. This man on the right is Bill Langston, and Bill Langston was and is world famous. He was my mentor when I was 21 years old, and Bill Langston discovered the patients with MPTP-induced Parkinsonism. And for those of you who've never heard the story, in the 1980s, heroin was only illegal in America if it was exactly heroin. So what kitchen chemists were doing was slightly modifying heroin, attach a carbon atom or something else. So it wasn't exactly heroin, and then it was legal as sea salt. And if you were lucky, it gave you the same kick, the same boost as the original heroin. So one of those kitchen chemists had created a compound called MPTP. And MPTP was given to young drug addicts in their 20s and 30s. And they developed overnight, after intravenous injection, end-stage irreversible Parkinson's. I asked Bill if he had the videos of these patients in the 80s. He gave them to me. We published this in Lancet Neurology. And this is the very first MPTP patient. This is famous footage. This man was healthy the day before, mind you. Injected himself with heroin and has this terrible Parkinsonian state which never went away. And so did 6 other young drug addicts. The reason for showing this is that MPTP causes damage to the brain after it's converted to MPP+. That's the actual toxic component. And that's nearly identical to paraquat. So this is an experiment of nature, dreadful as it may be, that really draws our attention to the fact that Parkinson's might be environmental. And this is a human experiment, right? And what MPTP does is inhibit mitochondria. Mitochondria are the breathing organelles of nerve cells. They are the energy suppliers of nerve cells. And lo and behold, pesticides also inhibit the same mitochondria. The genes, most of the genes that we know that cause Parkinson's, also inhibit mitochondria. So probably mitochondria and pesticides and genes convene and cause toxicity for the same mitochondria. And what I find really interesting is many of you will know that a reduced smell is often preceding what later becomes Parkinson's disease. Many of you will recognize this. These 7 young drug addicts who had terrible Parkinson's were tested for smell, and it was perfect because the toxin had entered their body intravenously. The chemist who had manufactured the MPTP later developed Parkinson's 7 years later because he had a lower dose, he inhaled it, and he had an abnormal smell. So we now think that one of the reasons for the reduced smell, and there's actually wonderful work here in the group of Professor Maurice Curtis here in Auckland on looking at the olfactory bulb, and he believes that toxins might be part of the reason why smell is reduced early on in the disease process. Other evidence, which I find very convincing, is so-called heat map studies. André Barbeau is one of my heroes. My life is built around my heroes who have shaped me as a clinician and a scientist. André Barbeau was a famous neurologist and clinician in Canada, French-speaking Canada. And he was the first to see whether Parkinson's was showing up in clusters. So if Parkinson's was unrelated to the environment, André Barbeau reasoned, it should be evenly distributed across the country, like a porridge, where every bite is identical, tasting the same. And it turned out that was not the case. In French Quebec, Parkinson's was found in clusters. And those clusters tightly overlapped with the intensity of farming and the concentration of pesticides. This is a sort of a scientific graph, but on the x-axis, on the horizontal line, is the concentration of pesticides. On the y-axis is the risk of developing the disease. So there's a dose-response relationship which suggests causality. The experiment was repeated in France by Alexis Elbaz. This is France and the intensity of pesticide use in France, and the risk of Parkinson's is overlapping very closely with the intensity of pesticide use in France. And with even, again, a dose-response relationship. So the higher the concentration of pesticides, the higher the risk of Parkinson's disease. And it's also been done in the United States. This is in Louisiana. And again, the dark areas is more Parkinson's, lighter areas is less Parkinson's, and the dark areas had more pesticide use. In this case, it was glyphosate, Roundup. A big question in my country is tulips. And a number of studies have now shown that if you live near tulip fields, you have a higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease. There's intense use of pesticides on our Dutch tulips. And what I find a vexing paradox is that the international symbol of the fight against Parkinson's is the same darn tulip. Isn't that crazy? I find that the weirdest thing. And like I told you before, you might reason, oh well, it's too late for me. But pesticides are also related to faster disease progression. This is just one study. This has the risk of dying from Parkinson's on the y-axis. And you see in red that people who are not exposed to pesticides live longer than people who are exposed to pesticides after the diagnosis. So whether a biological diet free from pesticides helps to protect you, we don't know. That study has never been done, but I tell people in my clinic, if I develop Parkinson's tomorrow, I will do two things. Well, I'll do many things, but I will live on the treadmill, I will exercise my butt off, and I will steer away from pesticides and other toxic chemicals. Maintain regular bowel movements also. And then because I'm a real activist, we live in a blessed part of the world. I think this is a blessed country, you have a good healthcare system, beautiful scenery, lovely people. But pesticides that have been banned in Europe are dumped onto the market in Africa, which I think is insane if you come to think of it. This is the daughter of one of my former fellows, Marieke Dekker. And Marieke Dekker now lives and works in Tanzania. This is her daughter, who is 6 years old at the time, and the red bags in the background are rotenone bags, banned and forbidden in Europe, dumped onto the market in Africa, where combined with an aging population, fortunately these people are growing older, these pesticides are now leading to an explosion of Parkinson's. We just published this paper in Journal of Parkinson's Disease. You can see the growth in the use of pesticides in sub-Saharan Africa, which is enormous. And these are the number of pesticides that have been banned in Europe. That's at the top. And look at the number of pesticides that have been banned in Africa. It's virtually none. And in fact, whatever is banned in Europe is exported to Africa. And even in a quote-unquote civilized country such as the United States, I'm among friends here, so I dare to say that, paraquat disproportionately affects underserved communities. So people with a Latino background are more often the laborers on the countryside, and their risk of being exposed to pesticides is higher than for richer people. So that's unfair. It's disproportionate, and it's not fair. So one reason we should become activists is that the current screening procedures are inadequate. Now we're coming to an important part. So fortunately, many toxic chemicals have been banned. Not all of them, not paraquat in this country. The problem is that we don't know whether current pesticides are safe or not. We published this paper in Lancet Planetary Health to draw attention to the fact that current regulatory actions are inadequate. As it turns out, what the EPA is doing, and its counterpart, the EFSA in Europe, is feeding pesticides to a mouse and waiting for it to become Parkinsonian. The problem is, the beauty of our brain is that it has a huge reserve. The animal will only start to look Parkinsonian after you've killed 70% of the dopamine neurons. So if a pesticide kills 60% of the neurons, the pesticide is all but safe, but the animal looks perfectly sound and happy, and the product goes onto the market. The second problem is the animals are only being fed pesticides. But the reality is that I think the majority of exposure in all of us is through inhalation. Remember smell? And pesticides are carried through the air for miles and miles and miles. But it's not part of regulatory actions. But if you inhale a pesticide, it doesn't pass the liver, and it might well be much more toxic. It can also enter your body through the skin. And this is a bit of a technical slide, but we now recognize that Parkinson's may either start in the gut, which probably happens if you eat pesticides, kills off neurons in the gut, and then it slowly spreads through the vagal nerve until it reaches your brain. We call this body-first Parkinson's. Or you inhale it, kills off your olfactory bulb, causes hyposmia, and then starts to attack the brain. In both cases, we feel that environmental toxins play a role. And this, now it becomes even more worrisome, because regulatory actions only look at single compounds. They look at paraquat or they look at Roundup. But the reality is that all of us, farmers, neighbors, all of us, are exposed to complex mixtures of multiple pesticides. But that's never been tested. The Dutch SPRINT study, which is a study in 9 European countries and in Argentina, has shown, well, I'll let you guess, how many pesticides are there in household dust in Dutch farms and their neighbors? How many? Give me a number.
8.
8. A higher bid? Well, 1,000 is to 70. It's 100. 100 different pesticides. Isn't that crazy? What does 100 times a small concentration doing? We don't know. We don't know because they don't test for it. What we do know is that Kimberly Paul, a wonderful scientist, again from California, did a very clever experiment, and she published this in Nature. This is a top-notch journal. She looked at commonly used mixtures of pesticides that farmers are using. So there's 2 problems. One is farmers use mixtures of different pesticides. They don't use one, they use mixtures. And if they don't use a mixture, the mixture will arise because it drifts through the air for miles and miles. So she looked at commonly occurring mixtures. If you then take a dopamine cell culture, glass little Petri thing, and you put dopamine cells in it, if you add one pesticide of the cocktail, it is toxic at a very high dose. The moment you add a second pesticide, they are both toxic at a very low dose. But nobody tests for the combinations. They just don't do it. So we had a meeting. I insisted on speaking to the EFSA, which is the counterpart of the EPA. And eventually they consented that we would meet. And I expressed my concerns. And this is a literal copy of the minutes of the European authorities. And they admit that their procedures give us an inadequate insight in the risk of Parkinson's disease. They admit that they do not have the right tools. You can read this faster than I can read it out. Isn't that stunning? So it is, the metaphor that I use is, you're trying to find landmines without having a metal detector. And then we have to fight a powerful enemy, which is called industry. This is a paper that says glyphosate is safe. These are the disclosures of the authors, sponsored by Monsanto. So they publish papers, by people paid by Monsanto. That's one thing. The other thing industry does is, and this book is worth reading, it's called Merchants of Doubt. And what industry does, so what the tobacco industry was doing in the 50s, when smoking turned out to be a cause of cancer, they said, no, it's not smoking, it's poverty. Because poor people smoked more often. So it's casting reasonable doubt. So then it was up to the scientists to do new experiments to prove it wasn't poverty, but it was smoking. Each year gained for industry is billions of dollars. So it's all postponement strategies. And in this case, they say, well, it's not pesticides, it's copper. And perhaps copper contributes to the risk of Parkinson's, but it shouldn't steer away from the fact that these pesticides are highly toxic. So that's another strategy they're using. And then they are withholding critical information from regulatory bodies. We know that Syngenta has withheld studies that show toxicity of paraquat from regulatory actions. That's criminal, I think. And then they've got lobbyists. Bayer has 30 paid lobbyists in Brussels. And here is the little Bas Bloem trying to fight, the big enemy. I'm not giving up, by the way. But, so how to deal with this uncertainty? We're reaching the end. So I think there's two strategies. Industry wants me to prove that pesticides are the cause of Parkinson's. And just for your reassurance, there are now 6, 7 big studies in my group in the Netherlands that try to further provide evidence that pesticides are the cause of Parkinson's. But I think the burden of proof should shift. If you are a company that wants to make billions of dollars by selling a product that is designed to kill, it's designed to kill fungi, weeds, and whatnot, then it's up to you to prove its safety with properly designed experiments, which includes cell counts in the substantia nigra, it includes cocktails, it includes multiple inhalation and other routes of exposure. And if the pesticide proves to be safe, you won't hear me complain. But until then, I think we should stop pesticides, go back to the drawing boards and reassess them. And just to give you some encouragement, we talked about smoking. The benefits of quitting. People say, isn't it not too late? This is smoking, but imagine we can do the same thing for pesticides. If you quit smoking, within 20 minutes, your heart rate will drop. 12 to 24 hours, carbon monoxide in your blood will drop. 2 weeks to 3 months after quitting, your risk of having a heart attack will drop. And you can read this. It is so encouraging. It is so encouraging, and it goes on, 50 years of quitting, your risk of coronary heart disease is the same as that of a non-smoker. What if the risk of Parkinson's in 15 years was down? If we divert that curve and stop the pandemic from growing, protecting your children, protecting next generations. This is a brand new paper that we, in a sort of a positive, we just published this in Nature Reviews. And we say, well, look, we need better regulatory actions. We need to move towards biological agriculture. And we give all sorts of practical advice on how to move forward from here on with practical recommendations for regulatory bodies. This is what the experiment should look like. So to conclude, action is needed. And we've talked about Parkinson's today, but the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine. Do you know that? So the canary is a warning signal. If we ban pesticides, if we ban trichloroethylene, if we promote exercise, we not only stop Parkinson's from growing, we will prevent cancer in children. Glyphosate has been linked to leukemia in young children. So if we stop pesticides, if we stop TCE, we stop a lot of other health risks. So we do something good for society at large. And this is the Bloem, the optimist. I think we're close to the tipping point. I'm a real activist, but I see things changing in Europe. We're getting new grants to study this properly. I'm one-to-one speaking to regulatory actions. And I'm on a mission to stop the growth of Parkinson's, to help protect you, protect all of us from exposure to these chemicals. And the only way of doing it is doing it together. So I'm really happy that I've now made new friendships here in New Zealand. We decided we want to work together. People such as Professor Tim Anderson, Barry Snow, Maurice Curtis, Andrew Bell, who, by the way, receives a round of applause for his hospitality. Can we have that? So this is my final slide. Collaboration is the new competition. Don't do it alone. Let's do this fight together and beat Parkinson's. Thank you.